In the quiet town of Mbale, Nabirye was known as the proud and elegant first wife of Kalume, a successful and respected trader. For years, she stood by his side, sharing in his wealth but carrying a silent burden. They had no children, though she smiled in public and kept her head high. Deep inside, her heart ached for the child she never had. Kalume, wanting an heir, made a decision that changed everything. Without telling Nabirye, he secretly married a younger woman named Zubeda, soft-spoken, beautiful, and full of life. When Zubeda gave birth to a baby girl named Nambi, the joy in Kalume's eyes was something Nabirye had never seen before. That sight alone shattered something inside her. She forced a smile, pretending to accept it all, but in the corners of her heart, jealousy began to grow like a weed. Everyone in the town whispered behind her back. Some pitied her, others judged her, but Nabirye said nothing. She just watched Zubeda with her baby, watched Kalume beam with pride, and all the while, a storm was building quietly inside her, a storm made of pain, fear, and the silent cry of a woman who felt like she was slowly being erased from her own life. It happened on a quiet night, the kind that felt too still, almost warning of something terrible. Zubeda had only been a mother for a few short months when she was found lifeless in her sleep. No sickness, no signs of struggle, just gone. The town buzzed with whispers. Some said she looked too peaceful. Others claimed her lips were too pale, her skin too cold. And then the rumors began. Poison. But there was no proof. No one dared speak too loudly, especially not about Nabirye. At the funeral, the air was heavy with sorrow and confusion. People cried, but Nabirye didn't shed a single tear. She stood tall, holding the crying baby in her arms, her face unreadable. Little Nambi wailed for the mother she'd never know, her tiny fists clinging to the only warmth left. Nabirye rocked her gently, almost mechanically. Inside, a quiet thought echoed in her mind. She's mine now. Not a question, not a wish, a decision. Kalume, broken by grief, could barely stand. He leaned on others, his eyes hollow. In his pain, he didn't see the way Nabirye watched the coffin. He didn't notice how tightly she held the baby, how her fingers never loosened. As the soil covered Zubeda's grave, Nabirye made her own vow, one that no one heard but her. Zubeda was gone, and Nabirye would make sure her memory faded, just like the flowers that would wilt on her grave. The child would grow up calling her Mama. No one needed to know the truth. Nabirye took on the role of mother with full force. From the outside, it looked like love. She dressed Nambi in the finest clothes, bought her the best toys, and gave her everything money could buy. People in Mbale would often say, "What a lucky child," not knowing the truth behind the perfect picture. But behind the soft smiles and warm meals, there was a different kind of love, one that came with invisible chains. Nabirye was strict, always watching, always controlling. Nambi wasn't allowed to ask too many questions. She had to follow every rule, no matter how small. If she asked about her real mother, Nabirye's face would darken and the subject would change instantly. Over time, Nabirye began telling a different story, one that painted her as the only mother Nambi had ever known. "Zubeda left you," she would say with a cold finality. "She didn't want you, I did." The lie was repeated so often that even the townspeople started to believe it. Children at school whispered what their parents had heard, that Nambi had been abandoned and Nabirye had saved her. Kalume, still drowning in guilt and sorrow, said nothing. His eyes seemed far away, as if part of him had died with Zubeda. He didn't argue when Nabirye rewrote the past. He didn't fight for the truth. Maybe he thought it was easier that way. Maybe he thought it was what Nambi needed. But in that silence, the truth began to disappear. And so Nambi grew up in a beautiful house, with everything she could ever want, except the truth. She called Nabirye Mama, and tried her best to be the perfect daughter. But sometimes, late at night, she would cry for reasons she didn't understand. Somewhere deep inside her, a tiny voice whispered that something wasn't right. But no one around her ever listened to that voice. Not yet. Nambi's 5th birthday was supposed to be a happy day. The house was decorated with balloons, her favorite cake was on the table, and neighbors came by with gifts and smiles. Nabirye made sure everything looked perfect, the way she always did. But something felt off from the start. The family's cat, usually calm and friendly, stood outside Nambi's bedroom door and hissed. No matter how many times they tried, it refused to go inside. It just stared at the room with wide, frightened eyes and backed away. Later that evening, while cleaning up, one of the mirrors in the hallway suddenly cracked, not shattered, just split down the center like a warning. No one had touched it. No wind, no noise, just the sound of glass breaking without reason. That night, Nabirye lay in bed and thought she heard someone whisper. The voice was soft, almost like a sigh, but clear enough to freeze her blood. "Give her back." She sat up, heart pounding, but the house was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. Then came the dreams. Nambi began waking up crying, trembling, pointing to the corner of her room. "She's calling me," she whispered once, barely audible. When Nabirye asked who, Nambi just said, "The lady in white. She says she's my mama." At first, Nabirye told herself it was just a child's imagination, just bad dreams. But the dreams didn't stop. Night after night, Nambi spoke of a woman with long black hair and a soft voice who called her my daughter and asked her to come closer. Nabirye started losing sleep. She would walk the halls at night, hearing faint whispers that vanished when she turned her head. Lights flickered. The air in Nambi's room often felt cold, even when the windows were shut. Something was changing. Something was waking up. Nabirye tried to ignore it, to hold on to the life she had built, but the past she had buried wasn't staying quiet. It was reaching out through the eyes of a child, and it wanted to be heard. Far from town, at the edge of Mbale, where the trees grow thick and the wind always seems to whisper, Zubeda's grave began to change. At first, it was small, just a slight dip in the earth. But as days turned into weeks, the ground started to sink deeper, like something below was shifting, unsettled. The villagers noticed. They started avoiding the path near the graveyard, especially when the moon was full. Some said they saw a woman's shadow moving between the graves, dressed in white, her hair floating behind her like smoke. Others swore they heard soft crying carried on the wind. One evening, a village priest came to Kalume's home. His voice was low, his face serious. He said, "A spirit cannot rest if truth is buried with it. Something isn't right, Kalume. Her soul is not at peace." Kalume, already worn thin by grief and the strange happenings around his daughter, felt a chill run down his spine. The words haunted him. He began to question the silence he had accepted for so long. He thought about Zubeda's sudden death, the strange way Nabirye had taken over, and the things Nambi had started saying in her sleep. But when he brought it up to Nabirye, her reaction was cold. She didn't blink. "People talk too much," she said sharply. "Zubeda is gone, that's all." She refused to entertain the idea of anything unnatural. "It's just bad weather, soil shifts. People imagine things when they miss someone," she added, brushing it off like it was nothing. But Kalume couldn't unhear the priest's words. He couldn't stop thinking about the grave, sinking like it was trying to pull the past back to the surface. And at night, when he passed Nambi's room and heard her whispering in a voice too old for her age, he began to wonder if the truth they had buried wasn't just haunting them. Maybe it was fighting its way back. And maybe, just maybe, the dead were no longer willing to be forgotten. It started with whispers in the middle of the night. Nabirye would walk past Nambi's room and hear her talking in her sleep, but the voice wasn't Nambi's. It was older, softer, deeper. At first, Nabirye told herself it was just her imagination, just the wind playing tricks on her tired mind. But then the things Nambi said started to change everything. One night, Nabirye stood quietly by the door and listened. Nambi, still asleep, spoke in a voice that didn't belong to a 5-year-old. She described a necklace Zubeda used to wear, a gold chain with a tiny bird charm. She talked about how Zubeda used to sing by the window when it rained, how she had once hidden letters under her mattress, things only Zubeda could have known, things Nambi was never told. Nabirye felt her chest tighten. Fear crept in, slow and heavy. Every day, she watched Nambi more closely. She jumped at small sounds, flinched at shadows. She stopped letting Nambi out of her sight, always keeping her close, not out of love, but out of fear. Because deep down, Nabirye knew something was wrong. Something was waking up inside that child. And it wasn't just grief or memory. It was Zubeda. Then came the night everything changed. Nabirye was tucking Nambi into bed when the little girl suddenly sat up. Her eyes were wide but calm, her voice too steady. She looked straight at Nabirye and said quietly, "Why did you kill me?" Nabirye froze. Her hands trembled. For a moment, the room felt ice cold. Nambi blinked, as if waking from a dream, and laid back down without another word. But the damage was done. Nabirye knew this was no longer a dream, no longer something she could explain away. Zubeda was speaking through the child, and she wanted answers. The truth Nabirye had buried was rising, and this time it had a voice, a small, innocent voice, carrying the weight of a murdered mother's pain. Nabirye couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the dreams, the cold stares from a child who shouldn't know the truth. It was all becoming too much. Her hands shook every time Nambi spoke. She barely slept, jumping at every creak in the house, every flicker of light. It felt like something was watching her, following her, waiting. So one night, desperate and afraid, she made her way through the dark to the edge of the village, to a small hut where the old shaman lived. The shaman had seen many things in his time, but even he looked uneasy when Nabirye walked in, pale and shaking. She fell to her knees before him and broke down. Through tears and gasps, she told him everything. How she had poisoned Zubeda out of jealousy. How she couldn't bear the thought of being pushed aside, forgotten, unloved. She said it was only meant to be quick, quiet, something no one would ever know. But now, she whispered, Zubeda wouldn't let go. She's using the child, Nabirye sobbed. She's inside her. She wants her back. The shaman was silent for a long time. Then he looked Nabirye straight in the eyes and said, Spirits don't rest when the truth is buried in lies. You didn't just steal a life. You stole a bond that cannot be broken. If the child is not returned, the mother's soul will take what's hers. In blood. Nabirye's heart dropped. But she's already dead, she whispered. The shaman shook his head slowly. A mother's love doesn't end in the grave, and neither does her pain. If her spirit has returned, it means justice is unfinished. Nabirye left the hut with her chest heavy, her legs weak. She had hoped for a cure, a way to stop the haunting, but instead, she got a warning, one she could feel burning in her bones. Zubeda wanted her daughter back, and if she didn't get her, something far worse was coming. Nabirye had only one thought left in her mind, escape. She packed a small bag in the middle of the night, picked Nambi up from her bed, and left without a word. She didn't tell Kalume. She didn't say goodbye. She just ran, hoping that distance could silence the whispers and shadows that had taken over their lives. But she was wrong. The spirit followed. It didn't care about roads or borders. It was tied to the truth and to the child. As soon as they reached the first town, things started happening. The lights in their rented room began to flicker violently. Then they exploded, sending shards of glass across the floor. Doors slammed on their own. Furniture shook without warning. Nambi began waking up screaming, her small voice filled with terror. She's here, she cried. She's looking at you, Mama. But Nabirye knew Nambi wasn't talking about her. Back in Mbale, people in the village started seeing things too. A woman in white was spotted near the river, her long hair wet and hanging like vines. She was silent but stared straight at anyone who looked her way. Others saw her walking through the fields at night, glowing under the moonlight, her feet not touching the ground. They didn't need to ask who it was. Everyone knew. Zubeda's soul had risen, and she was searching. Then, one night, Nambi vanished. Nabirye had only stepped out of the room for a few minutes. When she came back, the window was wide open, the air freezing cold, and the bed was empty. Panic filled her chest like fire. She screamed, searched the streets, knocked on doors, crying for help, but no one had seen the child. Hours passed. At dawn, they found her. Curled up peacefully, Nambi was fast asleep on Zubeda's grave. Her small fingers were wrapped around the edges of the tombstone like she'd been holding on in a dream. She looked calm, almost smiling. No one could explain how she got there, miles away from town. No one had seen her walk. But one thing was clear. She had been taken, not by force, but by love. Zubeda's spirit had led her home. The village could no longer ignore what was happening. Too many signs, too many whispers, too much fear. After Nambi was found asleep on her mother's grave, the elders called for a cleansing ritual, something that hadn't been done in years. They said Zubeda's spirit wasn't angry, just broken. She needed peace, and the truth was the only way to give it to her. A fire was lit in the center of the village. The whole community gathered around it as the old priest and the shaman prepared sacred herbs and chants. Nabirye was brought forward. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. There was no more running, no more lies. With everyone watching, neighbors, elders, Even Kalume, she finally spoke. Her voice cracked as she confessed. She told them how she poisoned Zubeda out of jealousy and fear, how she couldn't bear the thought of being replaced. She cried as she spoke, but no one comforted her. The pain she caused had stretched beyond life. It had torn a hole between the living and the dead. Then came the hardest part. Nambi was brought to the circle, holding Kalume's hand. She looked so small, but so calm, like deep down she already knew. As the truth was spoken aloud, the flames flickered high, and the air turned still. The shaman turned to Nabirye and said, "You took her mother's life, but you must now protect what remains of it." Nabirye was told she could only be forgiven if she agreed to raise Nambi not as her own child, but as Zubeda. She had to speak Zubeda's name with love, honor her memory, and keep her spirit alive in Nambi's heart. With tears running down her cheeks, Nabirye nodded. "I will raise her in her mother's name. I swear it." At that moment, the wind shifted, the fire calmed, and somewhere in the distance, the village dogs stopped howling. They all knew what it meant. Zubeda had heard. Her soul, heavy with sorrow, could finally rest. But the weight of what had been done would never fully disappear. Nabirye had saved herself not with magic, but with truth. And now, her second chance had to be earned. One day, one promise at a time. Years passed, and the little girl who once spoke in whispers of the dead grew into a woman with a voice that could move mountains. Nambi never forgot the truth, not the pain, not the loss, and certainly not the love of a mother she never got to know in life, but who had fought for her, even in death. She carried that story in her heart like a flame. It guided her through school, through every hardship, and into a life of purpose. Nambi became a human rights lawyer, fierce and fearless, standing up for women and children whose voices were ignored, whose stories were buried like her mother's once was. She made it her mission to protect those who had no one, to make sure silence would never win again. With her first case victory, Nambi used the money to open a shelter. She named it Zubeda's Light. People came from all over, women fleeing abuse, young girls cast aside, children without homes. Nambi welcomed them all with warmth and strength. She told them, "You are not alone. Your story matters." In the hallway of the shelter, right above the entrance, hung a photo of a young woman in a white dress, Zubeda. Nambi never called her the dead. She called her my mother. And on quiet nights, when the wind passed gently through the trees outside, Nambi sometimes felt something warm wrap around her heart, as if the spirit who once whispered through nightmares was now watching in peace, proud and at rest. Justice had come, not in court, but through legacy, through love, through a daughter who refused to forget.